That just showed you how quickly she was working towards this marriage, that she had already decided to plan her honeymoon before the engagement.
No one saw it coming. During a live Daystar broadcast, Joyce Meyer dropped a confession so unexpected that even Joni Lamb, the unshakable host, known for her composure, was left completely speechless. The studio fell silent, the audience froze, and what happened next has everyone talking. For years, these two women stood side by side in faith, but this revelation changed everything. Viewers are calling it the most shocking Daystar moment ever caught on camera. It was supposed to be a normal show. The cameras were rolling, the studio lights glowed softly, and Joni Lamb sat in her familiar spot, smiling at the audience. The topic for the day wasn't anything unusual, just another uplifting conversation about faith and perseverance. Sitting across from her was Joyce Meyer, one of the most respected and recognizable names in Christian broadcasting. The two women had shared countless moments on air before, filled with laughter, wisdom, and inspiration. But this time felt different. Even before the storm began, there was a quiet tension in the room that no one could quite explain. As the broadcast moved along, Joyce's tone began to shift. Her voice softened, her eyes turned serious, and the room seemed to grow colder. Then she did something no one expected. She went off script. Looking straight into the camera, Joyce began to speak from her heart. Her words weren't rehearsed, and they weren't easy to hear. She talked about Daystar, about how she felt the network had lost its way since Marcus Lamb's passing. Her voice didn't tremble, but every sentence carried weight. It used to be about faith and humility, she said softly. Now it feels more like control, more like a show than a ministry. The air left the room. Joni froze, her confident smile fading as the words hit her like a wave. She blinked rapidly, trying to compose herself, but the hurt was visible. For a moment, she tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground, but Joyce didn't stop. Her tone wasn't angry. It was sorrowful, almost pleading, as if she had been carrying these words for a long time and finally couldn't hold them in anymore. Behind the cameras, the crew exchanged nervous glances. No one dared move or speak. The audience sat in stunned silence. They all knew they were witnessing something that wasn't supposed to happen, something raw and real that cut through the polished world of Christian television. When the show finally went to a commercial break, Joni sat perfectly still, staring at the table. She didn't cry, not yet, but her hands trembled slightly as she removed her microphone. The crew whispered quietly, unsure what to do. The broadcast was over, but the shock was only beginning. Within hours, clips of the moment were everywhere. The internet lit up with reactions. Viewers debated whether Joyce was brave or out of line. Some said she had simply spoken the truth. Others claimed she had betrayed a friend on live television. But everyone agreed on one thing. They had never seen Joni Lamb like that before. The poised, confident face of Daystar had been caught completely off guard, stripped of her calm and left speechless by someone she had once called a sister in faith. That single broadcast changed everything. It wasn't just a moment of tension between two women. It was a spark that revealed cracks running deep beneath the glossy surface of one of the most powerful ministries in the Christian world. When the cameras stopped rolling that day, silence filled the Daystar studio. The audience had already left, but the tension still hung in the air like a thick fog. Joni Lamb sat quietly in her chair, trying to steady her breath. For years, she had built her image on calm composure, on faith that never wavered. But Joyce Meyer's words had hit a place deeper than anyone realized. They weren't just criticism, they were truth, wrapped in the kind of honesty that burns. In the days that followed, the fallout was impossible to ignore. Clips of the interview flooded social media, spreading faster than wildfire. People couldn't stop talking about it. Did you see Joyce call her out? Was that real? Is Daystar in trouble? The internet buzzed with theories and debates. Some defended Joni fiercely, saying Joyce had crossed a line. Others said Joyce had only said what many were already thinking, that Daystar had changed since Marcus Lamb's death. Behind the polished doors of the Daystar offices, the atmosphere was tense. Staff members whispered in hallways, unsure of what they were allowed to say. Some were loyal to Joni, refusing to believe anything could be wrong. Others had quietly noticed the shift long before Joyce spoke out. The warmth that once filled the building, the laughter, the sense of shared purpose, had slowly faded. Meetings became colder, decisions more private, and people started to feel like they were walking on eggshells. It hadn't always been this way. When Marcus was alive, Daystar had felt like a family. He led with heart, often stopping to pray with his team or encourage someone who was struggling. There was a sense of unity that kept everything together, but when he passed, a hole opened that no one could fill. Joni tried to step in, but grief has a way of changing people. Her once open, kind demeanor became guarded. She started to handle everything herself, determined to prove she could keep the ministry alive on her own. At first, no one questioned it. She was mourning, and people wanted to give her space. But as time went on, her leadership began to look different. Where Marcus had built bridges, Joni built walls. Decisions were made behind closed doors, and longtime team members found themselves excluded. The network that had once felt driven by purpose now felt controlled by fear. Some said it was just Joni trying to protect her husband's legacy. Others whispered that the ministry had become more about image and influence than faith. Then came Doug Weiss. His arrival changed everything again. As Joni's new husband and a well-known Christian counselor, he brought his own presence, confident, polished, and assertive. To some, he seemed like a stabilizing force, someone who could help Joni shoulder the weight of leadership. But to others, his influence felt overpowering. He wasn't just supporting Joni, he was shaping decisions, directing conversations, and becoming a face of Daystar himself. Suddenly, the ministry felt less like a family and more like a brand. People inside the network started to feel uneasy. Longtime staff members who had worked with Marcus for decades began to leave quietly. Some resigned, others were let go without much explanation. "It's not the same anymore," one former producer said. "You can feel the change. It's not about spreading faith. It's about control." The hallway gossip grew louder, but publicly, everything still looked perfect. Joni smiled on camera. The shows went on. Viewers saw the same faith-filled messages, the same polished production, and had no idea what was happening behind the scenes. Then Joyce's broadcast happened, and it was like pulling the curtain back on everything people had been too afraid to say. Her words gave voice to what so many had been thinking, but couldn't admit. Daystar had lost its heart. What had once been a ministry built on prayer, humility, and love had started to feel like a business built on power and perfection. For Joni, it was devastating. She felt attacked, betrayed, misunderstood. She told those close to her that Joyce didn't understand how much pressure she was under, how hard it was to keep everything running after Marcus was gone. "I'm doing my best," she said one night, her voice breaking. "But it feels like no matter what I do, people want to see me fail." Still, the damage was done. The cracks were now visible to everyone. Viewers began to notice subtle changes. Fewer guest ministries, more focus on Joni's own message, and the absence of familiar faces. Donations slowed. Comments on social media grew harsher. For the first time in years, Daystar's perfect image was slipping. Behind the scenes, Joni's inner circle tightened. Only a few trusted people were allowed into meetings. Even Jonathan Lamb, her son, and once a key part of the ministry, found himself increasingly shut out. The more she tried to control things, the more distant she became from the very people who had once helped her build everything. The truth was simple. Daystar wasn't collapsing overnight. It was cracking slowly from the inside. The cracks weren't just in the organization. They were in the relationships, the trust, and the faith that once held it all together. The broadcast had only exposed what had been there all along, the quiet breaking of something sacred. And as the world watched the drama unfold, one question lingered over it all. Could faith survive when the foundation it was built on had already started to crumble? The Lamb family had always looked perfect from the outside. They were the faces of faith, smiling, united, and always speaking about love, trust, and God's plan. For years, they had been the heart of Daystar, a family-driven ministry that touched millions. People tuned in to see them not just for sermons, but for the warmth that radiated between them. But behind those smiles, behind the cameras and the carefully chosen words, things were slowly falling apart. It began after Marcus Lamb's passing. His death left a hole in the family that no one knew how to fill. Marcus wasn't just a husband and father, he was the anchor. He had a way of keeping everyone connected, of balancing the spiritual and the personal, the business and the family. When he was gone, everything felt uncertain. Joni tried to hold it all together. She stepped into the role of leader, determined to honor Marcus's legacy and keep Daystar alive. For a while, everyone supported her. But grief changes people, And as the months passed, something in her began to shift. Jonathan, their son, had been preparing for years to take over the ministry. He had worked beside his father, learning everything from programming to production, from leadership to the heartbeat of the ministry. He loved Daystar, not as a business, but as a calling. When his father died, he assumed, like many others, that he would naturally take on a bigger role. But things didn't go as expected. Joni, now in charge, started making decisions without him. Meetings happened without his input. Plans were announced that he hadn't even seen. Slowly, he began to realize that the ministry he'd grown up in was slipping away from him. At first, he tried to stay calm. He told himself that his mother was just overwhelmed, that she needed time to adjust. But as months turned into years, it became clear that this wasn't temporary. Joni wasn't planning to step aside. She was taking full control. The shift was subtle at first, but soon it was impossible to ignore. People who had once answered to Marcus or Jonathan now reported directly to Joni. Her decisions became final. There was no more discussion, no more teamwork. Daystar wasn't a family-run ministry anymore. It was hers. Then came Doug Weiss. His arrival changed everything. Joni's new marriage surprised many, including her own children. To the outside world, it looked like a story of hope, a woman finding love again after tragedy. But to those inside the family, it felt complicated. Doug wasn't just a husband. He quickly became part of the ministry, attending meetings, sharing opinions, and slowly becoming a figure of influence. Some welcomed him, saying he brought structure and strength. Others felt uneasy. To Jonathan, it felt like his father's legacy was being rewritten by someone who hadn't been there to build it. The distance between mother and son grew. Conversations that once ended in hugs now ended in arguments. They disagreed about leadership, direction, even the meaning of Marcus's vision. Jonathan wanted to keep things simple, focused on faith, family, and service. Joni and Doug, however, wanted to expand, to modernize, to push the ministry into a new era. It wasn't just about differences in opinion anymore. It was about power, and power, once introduced into a family rooted in faith, became poison. The tension spilled out of private walls and into the public eye. Rumors spread that Jonathan was unhappy, that he was questioning his mother's decisions. Those close to the family said he had been shut out completely. He stopped appearing in certain programs. His name was mentioned less and less in Daystar announcements. And then, one day, the news broke. Jonathan Lamb had been officially removed from his leadership position at Daystar. The statement from the network was polished and professional. It said Jonathan had refused to follow a performance improvement plan. It framed the move as a business decision, but to anyone who knew the family, it was clear this wasn't about business. This was personal. Jonathan was devastated. The ministry wasn't just his job, it was his life. He had given everything to it. To be pushed out by his own mother felt like betrayal. He didn't lash out publicly, but those close to him said he was heartbroken. "This isn't what Dad wanted," he told a friend quietly. He built Daystar for the family, not for one person to control. Inside Daystar, the atmosphere changed overnight. People started whispering in hallways. Some employees cried when they heard Jonathan was gone. Others feared they would be next. The family that had once been an example of unity was now divided down the middle. Staff members were forced to choose sides, stand with Joni and Doug, or quietly sympathize with Jonathan. The once warm halls of Daystar now felt cold, filled with tension and suspicion. Outside, the public reaction was just as intense. Viewers who had grown up watching the Lambs together couldn't believe it. Social media buzzed with speculation. Was Joni protecting the ministry or seizing control? Was Jonathan bitter or brave? Everyone had an opinion, but no one truly knew the pain happening behind closed doors. Meanwhile, Joni tried to keep the network moving forward. She smiled on screen, quoted scripture, and spoke about forgiveness and strength. But those who knew her best said she was struggling. She had lost her husband, and now, in trying to hold on to his vision, she had lost her son too. The cost of leadership was higher than she had ever imagined. Jonathan stayed mostly silent, though every once in a while he would post something on social media that hinted at his heartbreak, a Bible verse about truth, or a quote about betrayal and faith. It was clear that while he still loved his mother, he couldn't agree with what she had become. The family that had once represented unity in Christ was now fractured beyond repair. The Lambs, who had preached about love, forgiveness, and grace, were now living out a painful lesson in what happens when pride, grief, and control collide. The network that had once brought them together had become the very thing tearing them apart. Late at night, when the lights at the Daystar studio went dark, Joni sometimes stayed behind. She would sit in Marcus's old chair, looking at the photos of their family that still decorated the office walls, the smiling faces, the perfect image. She would close her eyes and whisper, "I'm trying, Marcus. I'm doing my best." But deep down, she knew that no amount of trying could erase what had been lost. Jonathan, on the other hand, found himself on a journey of faith, one that didn't include Daystar. He started to speak quietly at smaller events, sharing his heart about legacy, humility, and the danger of losing sight of what truly matters. People listened. His message wasn't angry, it was honest. Sometimes, he said in one interview, God lets things fall apart so the truth can be seen. And maybe that was the real story all along. Not a ministry collapsing, but a family learning, painfully, that faith isn't proven by how tightly you hold on, but by how willing you are to let go. The fallout from everything that happened at Daystar didn't come all at once. It came slowly, creeping in like a storm that refused to pass. The broadcast with Joyce Meyer had been the spark, but the fire had been burning long before that day. By the time the cameras stopped rolling and the lights dimmed, the damage was already done. What had once been a ministry rooted in faith, unity, and family now stood divided, its foundations cracking under the weight of pride, pain, and power. In the weeks that followed, the silence inside the Daystar offices was deafening. The same hallways that had once echoed with laughter and prayer now carried whispers and tension. Staff members didn't know where they stood anymore. Some still believed in Joni's leadership, convinced that God was simply taking the ministry through a period of refinement. Others couldn't shake the feeling that something sacred had been lost, that the ministry had become more about control than calling. The smiles on screen continued, but behind the scenes, faith was being tested in ways no one expected. Joni tried to hold everything together, but it wasn't easy. She had always been a woman of strength, polished, composed, and full of faith. But now, that faith felt different. It was no longer the confident faith she once preached about. It was fragile, bruised, and desperate. Every morning, she faced questions from staff, messages from viewers, and headlines from Christian media outlets that painted her as both a victim and a villain. She wanted to defend herself, to explain her side, but she knew that anything she said would only make the fire grow. So, she stayed silent. Her new husband, Dr. Doug Weiss, became her greatest defender. He took a more active role in the ministry, stepping into meetings and helping craft statements meant to calm the growing storm. To some, he was a reassuring presence, someone who gave Joni confidence when she felt alone. To others, he was part of the problem, a symbol of how far the ministry had drifted from its roots. The whispers about his influence grew louder, and so did the speculation about what was really happening behind closed doors. Meanwhile, Jonathan Lamb, once seen as the future of Daystar, was living in a very different reality. Cut off from the ministry his family had built, he struggled to make peace with what had happened. His faith, once steady and sure, was shaken. He had grown up believing that God always rewarded loyalty and truth, but now he wasn't sure what those words meant anymore. It's hard to pray for a family that doesn't feel like a family anymore, he told a close friend one night. His voice was quiet, almost broken. But I still do. I have to. The public continued to watch, hungry for answers. Every move the Lamb family made became a topic of speculation. Viewers analyzed Joni's tone during her broadcasts, searching for signs of strain. Online forums buzzed with theories about Jonathan's future, about Doug's role, about whether Daystar could survive without Marcus's guiding hand. Some people begged for reconciliation, praying for healing and unity. Others were convinced that what had been broken could never be fixed. Inside the ministry, morale continued to crumble. Long-time employees began to leave, some quietly, others with tears. It's not the same anymore, one staff member said before walking out for the last time. We used to be a family. Now we're just a brand. The network still functioned, still broadcasted programs and collected donations, but the spirit that had once made it feel alive seemed to have vanished. Faith was being replaced by fear, and the sense of mission was being overshadowed by damage control. For Joni, the hardest part wasn't the rumors or the criticism, it was the loneliness. The people she once trusted most were now distant. Her relationship with her children was strained, especially with Jonathan. Every time she thought about calling him, her heart ached. Pride held her back, even as guilt gnawed at her. Late at night, she would sit alone in the studio, staring at Marcus's old Bible on the desk. "You would know what to do," she whispered once, tears sliding down her face. "I'm just trying to keep it together." Despite everything, she refused to give up. She doubled down on her work, pouring herself into the ministry like it was the only thing keeping her alive. She spoke passionately on air about forgiveness, restoration, and faith through trials. To some, her words felt powerful, evidence that she was staying strong in the face of adversity. To others, they sounded hollow, as if she were preaching to herself, trying to convince her own heart that she still believed every word. As months passed, the outside noise began to quiet, but the cracks within remained. Donations slowly recovered, new shows were introduced, and the network continued to move forward. Yet everyone could feel that something was different. The ministry might still look the same on the surface, but its soul had changed. The unity that once defined Daystar was gone, replaced by a careful balance of appearances and survival. For Jonathan, the healing came slowly. He began to speak again, not on television, but in small gatherings and local churches. He talked about faith, forgiveness, and finding peace when life doesn't go the way you expected. He never mentioned his mother by name, but everyone knew what he was referring to. His words carried a quiet wisdom, born from pain and humility. Sometimes, he said, God doesn't fix what's broken. He just teaches you how to live with the cracks. The Lamb family story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even those who preach about faith aren't immune to the storms of pride, grief, and control. For all their fame and influence, they were still just human. Fragile, flawed, and struggling to find their way. And yet, in the middle of the mess, there were still glimmers of hope. Joni and Jonathan, though distant, occasionally exchanged brief messages, polite, cautious, but not cold. Maybe with time, those messages would turn into conversations. Maybe forgiveness would find a way through the ruins. For now, Daystar stands at a crossroads, not destroyed, but changed. Its future uncertain, its legacy complicated. The cameras still roll, the sermons still play, but behind every broadcast lies a deeper story. A story of faith tested, love fractured, and the painful truth that sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought in public. They're fought in the heart.